Hi everybody. This week we are going to be looking at the history of museums and analyzing the current state of art museums today. Museums play a very pivotal role in the preservation of culture. They're these types of memories of mankind. There are more than 17,500 of them just throughout the United States. 850 million people visit American museums annually. So to put this in perspective, only about 140 million people attend Major League Baseball, basketball, football, and hockey games combined each year. Before modern museums, there were these things called cabinets of curiosities. They began in Renaissance Europe and they displayed art, natural and exotic artifacts, and scientific instruments. They ranged in size, from as small as a dedicated piece of furniture with multiple drawers, or they could stretch to the size of an entire room. They were for the wealthy elite and were typically located in a private palace and were open only to the collector and his immediate circle. So they really functioned as these social status symbols. The owner of the collection was fully in charge of the interpretation and the content, and it was a reflection of their own taste and identity. As the amassing of objects grew and spilled off the shelves of furniture cabinets, collections started to take over entire rooms. Many of the objects were things that were collected on the owner's travels, items that could be shown off to their friends that inspired a sense of awe. Some, like the famous mermaids made by stitching together the torso of a monkey to the tail of a fish, were these wholly fantastical fabrications that were actually closer to art than natural evidence. Then in the 18th century, an intellectual movement called Enlightenment came around, and this centered around gaining an understanding of the world during the 18th century. The rise of science meant that collections could no longer just represent the wealth and intelligence of the owner, but that they needed to make sense of the world that we lived in a more objective way. The British Museum in London is the world's first public museum, and you see here how it emulates classical Greek architecture with the pediment and the columns. It has these 4 vast wings and 43 of those Greek temple-inspired columns, the triangular pediment, and enormous front steps. In the center of the museum is the Great Court, a 2-acre space enclosed by a glass roof. And in the middle of that space is the King's Reading Room. So the British Museum is what we call an encyclopedic museum. It encompasses more than 8 million objects, so it's really heavy on collecting, right? They can't display 8 million objects at once, but they conserve them, they catalog them, and they have them available either to display at their own museum or to loan out to other museums when they have an exhibition on display. The Louvre Museum in Paris was actually a palace before it was a museum, and it was the seat of the French monarchy. So it was strategically located on the banks of the Seine River, and it was originally this fortress around 1190. So today's massive structure is the result of centuries of expansion. It's much larger now than when it was originally built. It existed as the palace for the king, but it also served as a place to display his collection of art and to show off his wealth, his power, and his good taste. In France, art production was entirely controlled by the state at this time. In 1648, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was established, and this was an agency that oversaw the training of artists, as well as art criticism, art exhibitions, and sales. So members of the Academy met at the Louvre to debate what types of art were officially what they deemed acceptable, and select members of the public were invited there to see state-sanctioned art. These salons, as they were called, were the ancestors of today's modern exhibitions. But unlike today, they were largely inaccessible and were only open to the elite. Here's a view of the interior of the Louvre today. So how did we get there? The French Revolution occurred in 1789, and these revolutionaries sought to control the display of art by looting collections and taking control of these historic and these sacred sites. So churches and palaces were nationalized, and that famous former fortress, the Louvre, was remade as a public museum. The revolutionaries inaugurated the museum on August 10th of 1793, which was the first anniversary of the expulsion of Louis XVI, the last king, and it placed an enormous plaque announcing their gesture over the door to the Gallery of Apollo. So this said that any citizen with time and interest could visit. The monarchy was dead, and its possessions now belonged to the people of France. So to put this in perspective, kind of a timeline. In 1190, the Louvre was built as a fortress. Then we have the Royal Academy of Arts and Sculpture established, which was this state-sanctioned group of people that would declare what was acceptable art. 1789, the French Revolution comes into play. Then 1793, the Louvre is established as a public museum. But it wasn't until 1980 that there was any type of push for non-Western art to be added to their collection. Their early collection only included Western art, so things from like Greece, Rome, France, and Italy. African objects, for example, were completely rejected, ended up in places instead like the Trocadero, which was an exhibition hall built for the World's Fair of 1879. So it was there, in an international context dedicated to industrial development, that they were interpreted as these primitive objects, in contrast with technological and aesthetic wonders that were attributed to the West and to Europe specifically. The Art Institute of Chicago was founded as a museum and an art school in 1879. It houses roughly 30,000 works of art, and notice again this classically inspired architecture. There's that triangular pediment, there's these fancy Corinthian columns and relief sculpted friezes on the facade of the building. In addition, we can take a look at the logo. So notice about the type, the U has been rendered classically, the U in the word institute, like a Roman letter. It looks more like a V. Again, when we look at the interior, we see these ornate Corinthian columns and this sense of grandeur, right? It's what we talked about when why are modern and contemporary buildings still rendered classically is this idea of intellectualism and power and wealth. There's a modern edition, on the other hand, by architect Renzo Piano, and this has been rendered very differently. It's streamlined, it's geometric, it's not as ornate and highly detailed. But this classical inspiration is not just a Western aesthetic. Notice here Kyoto's National Museum in Japan is also inspired by classical architecture. So in the mid-1800s, the National Gallery in London started experimenting with picture placement. The director, Charles Eastlake, started hanging work at eye level instead of this salon-style hanging where they were piling them one on top of another all the way to the ceiling. So storage wasn't considered when museums were first built, and that's why everything was on display originally, because there was nowhere to keep it, nowhere to house it. But once they started minimizing what they were collecting, the need for curators arose. So this job, the job of the curator, was really created in the early 20th century. MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, their first director, Alfred Barr, implemented what he called a white cube strategy. So you notice kind of this minimalistic approach to display, right? Things are hung at eye level, they're spaced further apart. You can give your time and attention to one work at a time. And this is currently where we are still at, all in not just museums, but also galleries, collectors' homes. So when we talk about curators, we have to think about who they are and what necessarily is their role. Curators are essentially caretakers of museums' collections. Most museums have multiple curators, and they each specialize in a certain area. So you can have like a curator of photography, a curator of non-Western art, an ancient Egyptian art. All of those have separate curators because they're all experts in different fields. And these curators are responsible for assembling, cataloging, managing, and presenting artistic and cultural collections of museums. But I want us to take a look at a contemporary artist, Fred Wilson, who, even though he's an artist, he took on the role of a curator for his series called Mining the Museum. at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. So the mission of the Historical Society states that they educate people of all ages about the rich history and culture of Maryland and the nation. They collect, preserve, and interpret the historically significant art, objects, documents, and images from prehistoric Maryland to the present. But something about Maryland is that they're a very racially diverse state that has a lot of history. A lot of the first slaves were brought to places like Maryland, and the Historical Society, in their mission, when they state that they are preserving and interpreting historically significant art, Fred Wilson is wondering, well, who's deciding what is significant to your institution? So Wilson states that he remembers when he went to the Historical Society, he had this just kind of visceral response. He felt very uncomfortable there. And so what he did was he didn't create any of these works, but he looked through the collection at the Baltimore Historical Society and noticed that there were a lot of things that they had in their collection that they weren't putting on display. And he was wondering, why are certain things being kept hidden while some are being shown to the public? So what he did was switch that around. He curated in their collection his own display of objects. So this is one of his pieces, Metalwork, in which he juxtaposes these ornate silver pitchers and goblets with, if you notice in the front center, those are iron slave shackles that had previously not been on display at the Historical Society. So Wilson states, what they put on view says a lot about a museum, but what they don't put on view says even more. So he communicates this point by contrasting what is with what should be. He's drawing attention to the overlooked black figures. His installment asks whose truth was on display at the Historical Society. And by displaying these artifacts side by side, he creates an atmosphere of unease and highlights the link between the two kinds of metalworks, right? The production of the one was made possible by the subjugation enforced by the other. Here's another of his pieces. It's a baby carriage, and then you see a hood from a Ku Klux Klan outfit. So he exhibited this old baby carriage and put the Klan hood inside of it instead of, traditional bedding or a pillow. And it was placed next to a photograph of black nannies with white babies, essentially their future employers at this time, right? So again, Wilson's not making any explicit statements. He's not actually putting out labels or didactic information that explains these groupings to his audience, but he's providing them with a strong visual statement about the persistence of racial hierarchies. So he's suggesting here that children readily absorb their parents' prejudices. In addition, everyone who visited this exhibition was handed this piece of paper. So they were asked to just silently, internally ask themselves these questions while viewing his exhibition, but really this is pertinent to any museum goer visiting any exhibition. Ask yourself, what are you looking at? Where are you looking at it, and why is it there? What is it saying? How is it used? Who was this created for? Does it exist for those same people now, or has that changed? Who's represented and how? Who's doing the telling of this story? Who's absorbing it and doing the hearing? These just very basic questions that you give yourself when you're looking at a work of art. What do you see? What do you hear? Can you touch it? Do you feel anything? What do you think? Where are you, right? He's asking that we give adequate time and thought to what we're looking at. So he's leaving the audience to draw their own conclusions. There was also this painting by Justus Engelhard Kuhn in the exhibition of Henry Darnall III. So the label that existed when Wilson mined the museum is shown here. This full-length portrait shows Henry Darnall III as a boy in a yellow-orange tunic and green cape holding a bow and arrow. To the left is an African American boy in an orange coat holding a dead bird. Darnall stands in an architectural setting with balustrades at sides and formal gardens and buildings behind. So this label is really just describing what you see in the image. But when they're saying an African American boy in an orange coat, they're completely ignoring what else he's wearing. Take a second and look for yourself and see what's missing here. He's wearing this metal collar around his neck. So he is Henry's slave. These boys are not equals. One of them owns the other. So now, 25 years later, the museum's accompanying label has evolved, and it does say that the artist depicted Darnall with his slave, and this may be one of the earliest portraits of an African American slave that survives. Another group that speaks to what is shown in museums are the Guerrilla Girls. So since 1985, the Guerrilla Girls have operated as this anonymous group of female activists in the US who draw attention to the underrepresentation of both women and people of color in museums, galleries, and other art institutions. So they have these posters that were mass produced, and they call themselves the Guerrilla Girls because they were put out in public, just plastered all over New York City, asking these hard questions. Do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum of Art? They say that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So unlike Wilson, the Guerrilla Girls are not leaving any room for interpretation, right? They overtly call out museums and cultural institutions for their lack of inclusivity. But ironically, many museums own these prints and actually do display them, even though not much has changed to improve the inclusion of female artists and artists of color in museum collections. So a few things I want you to take away from this is the purpose of museums. They exist to conserve art and artifacts and to educate the public. Curators are those who choose what's acquired by museums and what is put on display. Those displays tell stories and provide larger overall cultural context. And it's really our job as museum goers to think critically about what is displayed and why it is displayed that way. And unfortunately, even though there have been steps toward inclusive collections and exhibitions, we're still really far away from actual equal representation. So a few things to do this week. I'm not assigning you any homework, but you do have to take a short quiz about the presentation on Moodle by the end of class time. And your research paper is due this Sunday at 11:59 in the Moodle Dropbox. Send any of your drafts to the Learning Resource Center. I'll send out an email with steps to do that again. And please get this in on time. Late papers are not accepted. If for some reason you're having trouble with Moodle and you can't upload it, just email it to me directly, but make sure that's before the deadline. Hope you're all doing well. Make sure you wash your hands. Don't touch your face. I'll see you next week.